The year is 1847. In Louisiana's sugar parishes, great white houses rise like wedding cakes from landscapes of unimaginable cruelty. Here, in the Fertile Crescent between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, fortunes bloom from soil enriched by blood and watered by tears. It is a world of violent contradictions, where gentility masks brutality, where hospitality depends on hostility, where the sweetest celebrations can turn bitter as poison. Our story centers on a wedding that became a funeral, a feast that became a reckoning, a trusted cook whose grief transformed sugar into venom. This is not a story of good versus evil, but of how evil systems corrupt everyone they touch, creating cycles of violence that end only when the systems themselves are destroyed. We invite you to witness this dramatization with both horror and understanding, horror at the extremes to which human cruelty can drive us, and understanding that resistance, even in its most terrible forms, is the inevitable response to oppression. The Beaumont plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of Louisiana's most fertile soil, its grand house gleaming white as the sugar it produced. From the river road, visitors saw only magnificence. Towering columns, manicured gardens, and oak trees draped in Spanish moss like nature's own wedding veils. But approach from the quarters, and a different truth emerged. Rough cabins crouching in the shadow of opulence, the constant smoke from the sugar house that burned day and night during grinding season, and always, the presence of the overseer's whip. Master Jean-Baptiste Beaumont prided himself on running an efficient operation. His ledgers, preserved in our fictional archive, reveal a man who recorded human beings with the same precision as hogsheads of sugar. Celia, age 38, cook, valued at $1,200. Excellent skills in both kitchen and herb garden. Mild temperament. 2 children sold 1844 and 1846. What the ledgers don't capture is the woman herself. Her knowledge passed down through generations. Her hands that could coax flavor from the simplest ingredients. Her eyes that had learned to hide everything. In the kitchen house, a building separate from the main plantation home, Celia reigned with quiet authority. For 20 years, she had fed the Beaumont family, learning their preferences, their weaknesses, their secrets whispered over wine. She knew that Master Beaumont took his coffee with 3 sugars to mask the bitterness of his failing liver. She knew that Mistress Beaumont required laudanum in her evening tea to sleep. She knew that young Adelaide, the bride-to-be, had inherited her mother's delicate constitution and her father's cruel tongue. The wedding preparations began in earnest 6 months before the blessed event. Adelaide Beaumont would marry Charles Ashford, uniting 2 of Louisiana's most powerful sugar dynasties. The house buzzed with plans for what society papers would call the wedding of the season. Celia found herself at the center of it all, planning menus that would feed 200 guests, training younger cooks, managing provisions that arrived by riverboat weekly. "We must have everything perfect," Mistress Beaumont declared during one of her kitchen inspections, her silk skirts carefully lifted above the brick floor. "The Ashfords must see that we are their equals in every way. Celia, I'm counting on you to create magic." She swept out without waiting for a response, never noticing how Celia's hands tightened on the knife she'd been using to trim pastry. But Celia noticed everything. She noticed how the family spoke around her as if she were furniture. She noticed how they praised her cooking to guests while forgetting she was human enough to feel pride or pain. Most of all, she noticed the empty pallet in the corner of her cabin where her daughter Mercy once slept, sold away 6 months ago to cover Master Beaumont's gambling debts in New Orleans. 12 years old, with Celia's same clever hands and quick mind, gone between one sunrise and the next. The kitchen house became Celia's laboratory of grief. By day, she perfected recipes for the wedding feast. Delicate cakes that would tower 5 layers high, punches that would sparkle with champagne and fruit, pralines that would melt on the tongue like sweet promises. By night, she tended her herb garden with new purpose, cultivating plants that had uses beyond seasoning. She had always known which leaves could cure and which could kill, knowledge passed from her grandmother, who learned it from hers, stretching back to African soil. Now, that knowledge took on new meaning. As spring turned to summer and the wedding approached, the Beaumont household never suspected that their most trusted servant, had become their most dangerous enemy. How could they? Celia still smiled when addressed, still created meals that drew praise from every guest, still moved through their lives with the invisible efficiency they had come to expect. They never imagined that revolution could simmer as quietly as a pot of gumbo, that vengeance could be measured in teaspoons, that a cook's greatest creation might be their last meal. The ancient oak stood 50 yards from the quarters, its spreading branches having witnessed generations of cruelty. The enslaved called it the whipping tree, though its proper name in the Beaumont family records was the discipline oak. It was here, on a humid morning in January 1847, that Celia's world shattered with the sound of her daughter's screams. The trouble began, as it often did, with money. Master Beaumont's fictional letters reveal a man living beyond even his considerable means. The wedding expenses, combined with a failed speculation in railroad stocks and mounting gambling debts, had created what he delicately termed a temporary liquidity crisis. The solution came during a card game at the St. Charles Hotel in New Orleans, when a cotton factor named Hutchinson mentioned needing a young housemaid for his mobile estate. "I can solve both our problems," Beaumont had declared, bourbon slurring his words. "I have just the girl, bright, trained, prime age. $1,200 and she's yours." The deal was struck over brandy and cigars, Mercy's fate sealed between one hand of cards and the next. Celia learned of the sale the night before, when Mercy came running to the kitchen house, tears streaming down her face. "Mama, they say I'm going to Alabama. They say I've been sold." The words hit Celia like physical blows. She had believed, foolishly, desperately, that her value to the family would protect her children. Master Beaumont had even promised as much years ago, when Celia had nursed his infant son through scarlet fever. That night, Celia did something she had never done before. She went to the big house after dark, climbed the back stairs to Master Beaumont's study, and knocked. When he bid her enter, she found him at his desk, already deep in his cups. The fictional scene that followed would be etched in both their memories. "Master Beaumont, sir," she began, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "About Mercy. Please, sir. She's all I have left. You sold James 2 years ago. Please don't take my baby girl." Beaumont looked up, his eyes struggling to focus. "Celia? What are you doing here? You know better than to come to the house at night." "Please, sir. I'll work extra. I'll train 2 new cooks. I'll do anything. Just please don't sell my child." His face hardened, the genial mask slipping. "The deal is done. Hutchinson's man comes for her in the morning. And Celia, remember your place. You're valuable, yes, but not irreplaceable. Now get out before I have you whipped for insolence." But the morning brought worse than separation. Mercy, in her terror, tried to run. She made it barely past the quarters before the overseer caught her. As punishment, and as a lesson to others who might think of running, she was brought to the whipping tree. 20 lashes for a 12-year-old girl, while her mother was forced to watch. Celia stood silent as the whip fell, her face a mask that revealed nothing. But inside, something fundamental broke and reformed. Each crack of leather on flesh was a covenant breaking, each of her daughter's cries a chain snapping. When it was over, when Mercy was cut down and loaded barely conscious into the wagon bound for Mobile, Celia helped tend her wounds one last time. "Be strong, baby," she whispered, pressing a small bundle of herbs into Mercy's hand. "Remember everything I taught you about the plants. Remember you're more than what they say you are." Then the wagon rolled away, taking the last of Celia's mercy with it. That night, Celia returned to her cabin and to her herb garden. She fingered the leaves of oleander, beautiful and deadly. She touched the foxglove, the nightshade, the pokeweed. Plants that could heal in small doses and kill in larger ones. Plants that grew wild in Louisiana, that no one would question in a cook's garden. Plants that might transform grief into action, suffering into strategy. From that day forward, Celia smiled more often at the Beaumont family. She became, if anything, more attentive to their needs, more creative in her cooking. Mistress Beaumont even commented to visitors about how losing her daughter seems to have made Celia more devoted to us. "You see, they're not like us in their attachments." But in the quiet hours before dawn, Celia worked with different ingredients. She tested preparations on the rats that plagued the storerooms, noting how long they took to die, whether they suffered, how much was needed. She learned that oleander, when properly prepared, could be made into a clear liquid that mixed well with sweet wines and sugar syrups. She discovered that the onset could be delayed by several hours if combined with certain fats, allowing a cook to be far from suspicion when symptoms began. 6 months. That's how long she gave herself to prepare. 6 months to perfect her recipes, both culinary and chemical. 6 months to ensure that when Adelaide Beaumont married Charles Ashford in a celebration of wealth built on stolen lives, the bill would finally come due. The whipping tree had taken her daughter's blood. Soon, the big house would know a different kind of reckoning. In the corner of the kitchen garden, where the shade fell heaviest and the soil stayed moist, Celia cultivated her revolution. To any casual observer, it appeared unremarkable. Just another patch of herbs and medicinal plants that every competent cook maintained. But hidden among the basil and sage grew deadlier specimens, each one carefully tended, each one a potential weapon in her arsenal of vengeance. The fictional journal of Dr. Marcus Thornton, the Beaumont family physician, would later note his professional admiration for Celia's botanical knowledge. The cook possesses understanding of plant medicine that rivals my own formal training. Her tinctures for Mistress Beaumont's headaches prove more effective than laudanum. Her poultices draw infection better than any preparation in my bag. One wonders where such learning originates among the enslaved. Where indeed. Celia's education came from her grandmother, Mama Ao, who had been taken from West Africa with a healer's knowledge intact. In whispered lessons by candlelight, Mama Ao had passed down the properties of plants both familiar and foreign. Every green thing has its purpose, she would say. Some to heal, some to harm, some to do both depending on the hand that wields them. Knowledge is power, child. Sometimes the only power we have. Now Celia put that power to methodical use. Her preparations began with inventory. Oleander grew wild along the property, its pink blooms beautiful and innocent-looking. She knew its leaves and stems contained cardiac glycosides that could stop a heart as surely as a bullet. Foxglove offered similar properties, though harder to disguise. Pokeweed berries could be reduced to a purple syrup that might pass for elderberry. Apple seeds and peach pits, when ground and processed, yielded prussic acid, though in quantities that would require explanation. The testing phase required delicate work. Celia couldn't risk discovery, so she worked in increments. A rat here, a stray cat there, always disposed of carefully in the river. She kept mental notes, never daring to write anything down. 3 oleander leaves, steeped in hot water for 20 minutes, created a tea that killed a rat in 2 hours. Ground into powder and mixed with sugar, the effect took longer but was harder to detect. Combined with alcohol, the symptoms intensified. Her breakthrough came when she discovered that oleander extract, when reduced and mixed with honey and butter, could be incorporated into baked goods without altering the taste significantly. The sweetness masked any bitterness, while the fat delayed absorption, creating a time gap between consumption and symptoms, perfect for a cook who needed to be visibly working when disaster struck. The moral weight of her planning sometimes overwhelmed her in the dark hours before dawn. She was preparing to commit murder, multiple murders. The Bible that Mistress Beaumont insisted all slaves learn from spoke clearly, "Thou shalt not kill." But that same Bible also spoke of justice, of liberation, of God striking down the oppressors of his people. And hadn't the Beaumonts killed first? Not with poison but with whips, with separation, with the slow death of bondage itself. Old Samuel watched her with knowing eyes as she worked her garden at unusual hours. One evening, as she carefully transplanted a new foxglove plant, he approached on silent feet. "That's a powerful lot of healing plants you growing," he said carefully. Celia didn't look up. "Mistress Beaumont's headache's been worse. Doctor says I should have more remedies ready." Samuel squatted beside her, his joints creaking. "My mama knew plants too. Knew which ones could make a man sleep forever. He eat enough of them." Their eyes met for a long moment. Finally, Celia spoke. "Sometimes sleep is a mercy." "Sometimes it surely is," Samuel agreed. Just be careful what pot you cooking in. Hate to see the wrong folks get served the wrong dish. It was the closest anyone would come to acknowledging what Celia planned. Samuel's warning was clear: protect the innocent. Celia had already considered this. The wedding feast would have 2 preparation areas: the main kitchen for the general guests, and a special station for the family table's delicacies. Only the Beaumonts and their closest relations would receive her special ingredients. As spring arrived and the oleander bloomed in profusion, Celia perfected her recipes. The wedding cake would be a marvel: 5 tiers of sponge soaked in brandy syrup, oleander infused, filled with custard, containing just a touch of foxglove, covered in pristine white icing. The punch, reserved for the family toast, would sparkle with champagne and fruit juices that masked other, deadlier liquids. Even the pralines, those sweet symbols of Southern hospitality, would carry their own bitter payload. By April, with the wedding just weeks away, Celia had everything she needed. Her arsenal was complete, her methods tested, her resolve hardened like sugar in flame. She had become what the system made her: a woman with nothing left to lose and the knowledge to take everything from those who had taken from her. In her cabin at night, she would hold the small rag doll that Mercy had left behind and whisper to it like a prayer: "Soon, baby. Soon they'll know what it costs to sell you away from me. Soon they'll learn that some recipes can't be forgotten, and some debts must be paid in full." Old Samuel had survived 70 years by seeing everything and saying nothing. His eyes, clouded with age but sharp with wisdom, had witnessed 3 generations of Beaumonts and countless tragedies among the enslaved. He knew when to speak and when to stay silent, when to warn and when to let fate take its course. But what he saw in the spring of 1847 tested even his hard-won prudence. Samuel's position as the head gardener gave him freedom of movement that few enslaved people enjoyed. His fictional testimony, recorded years later by abolitionists collecting slave narratives, would paint a picture of a man caught between loyalty to his people and fear of collective punishment. "I seen Miss Celia working her garden at all hours. Now, that weren't nothing strange by itself. Woman always did love her plants. But she was singing songs I ain't heard since my grandmother's time. African songs, death songs. And she was grinding things in a mortar that didn't belong in no cooking pot." The first time Samuel saw Celia harvesting oleander at midnight, he convinced himself she was gathering medicine for the quarters. When he spotted her testing something on a barn cat that later died in convulsions, he told himself it was rat poison. But when he observed her carefully separating her ground powders into different containers, some marked with tiny scratches only she could read, he could no longer pretend ignorance. Their confrontation came on a humid April evening, 3 weeks before the wedding. Samuel found Celia alone in the kitchen house, grinding something that released a bitter scent into the air. She looked up at his approach but didn't stop her work. "That don't smell like no seasoning," Samuel said quietly. Celia's hands never paused in their rhythm. "Lots of things don't smell like what they are. Miss Celia," Samuel's voice dropped even lower, "I know what grief can do to a person. Seen it twist folks up inside till they don't know right from wrong. But what you're planning, it won't bring Mercy back." For the first time, Celia's hands stilled. When she looked at him, her eyes were dry as drought. "Nothing will bring her back. That's the point." Samuel struggled with what to say next. He could report her to the overseer, potentially saving the Beaumont family and condemning Celia to a torture worse than death. Or he could stay silent and become complicit in whatever horror she planned. The weight of impossible choices pressed down on his bent shoulders. "If you do this thing," he finally said, "they'll kill every one of us. Not just you. They'll come down on the quarters like God's own wrath. The children, the old folks, everybody will pay for what you're fixing to do." Celia resumed her grinding, the sound like bones breaking. "They kill us anyway. Slow or fast, whip or sail, they kill us every day. At least this way, we take some of them with us." Samuel made one last attempt. "The young ones in the kitchen, Dora and Lucy, they don't know nothing about this? They'll be serving the outside tables," Celia assured him. "Far from the family's special feast. I'm not a monster, Samuel. I know who deserves what's coming." That night, Samuel made his choice. He didn't report to the overseer. He didn't warn the Beaumonts. Instead, he gathered the enslaved people he trusted most and spoke in careful riddles. Storm coming. Best keep to the quarters when it hits. Don't eat nothing from the big house that day. Keep the children close. Some understood. Others didn't. But the word spread in the way that crucial information always did among the enslaved. Whispered in the fields, hummed in work songs, passed through glances and gestures. By the wedding day, most of the quarters knew that something momentous would happen, even if they didn't know what. Samuel would carry the weight of his silence for the rest of his days. In his later testimony, he reflected, "People ask me why I didn't stop her, like I had that power, like any of us had the power to stop what slavery started. Miss Celia, she found the only power she could, the power to end things. Maybe it was wrong, but wasn't nothing right about none of it from the beginning. Let them eat cake." Authorities' blind spots. The Beaumont family prided themselves on their progressive management of human property. Unlike their neighbors who ruled through fear alone, they believed in the carrot as well as the stick. Master Beaumont's fictional memoir, discovered in this narrative's imagined archives, reveals a man who genuinely believed his own mythology. Our people are content because we treat them as the children they are, with firm guidance but also with recognition of good service. Celia, for instance, has been with us 20 years without a single infraction. Such loyalty deserves reward. The reward, in this case, was unprecedented access. Celia alone among the enslaved had keys to the wine cellar, the spice cabinet, and the medical supplies. She could order provisions from town merchants on the Beaumont account. She trained new kitchen staff without supervision. In their minds, the Beaumonts had elevated her as high as any enslaved person could rise, surely high enough to guarantee gratitude and continued faithful service. This blind spot extended throughout Louisiana's planter class. They feared organized rebellion. Images of Haiti haunted their dreams. They installed elaborate security against uprisings. Patrol systems, passes, harsh punishments for assembly. But they never imagined that revolution could simmer in a single heart, that vengeance could be measured in teaspoons, that the very intimacy of household slavery created vulnerabilities their paranoia couldn't address. Mistress Beaumont exemplified this willful blindness. Her diary entries from spring 1847 paint an unconsciously damning portrait. Celia continues to exceed all expectations with the wedding preparations. Yesterday she presented me with sample cakes that were simply divine, each more delicious than the last. I gave her carte blanche to order whatever ingredients she needs. After all, she's practically family. Practically family. The phrase encapsulated everything wrong with how enslavers viewed their household slaves. Close enough to trust with their children, their food, their intimate secrets, but never close enough to be truly human. This psychological contradiction created the perfect conditions for Celia's plan to succeed. The overseer, Thomas McKnight, represented another form of blindness. His job was to maintain order through violence and fear, and he excelled at it. But he focused entirely on the field hands, viewing house slaves as already broken, domesticated, harmless. His reports to Beaumont never mentioned the kitchen staff except to note their efficiency. Why would he? What danger could come from a middle-aged woman who smiled and cooked and had never raised her voice in protest? Even the warning signs were misinterpreted through the lens of their assumptions. When Celia requested more sugar than usual, they assumed she was perfecting the wedding cake. When she asked for access to certain medicinal herbs, they praised her for thinking ahead about potential stomach ailments from rich food. When she worked late into the night, alone in the kitchen, they saw dedication rather than determination. Dr. Thornton, the family physician, came closest to seeing the truth. Called to examine Mistress Beaumont for her persistent headaches, he noticed Celia's extensive herb garden and questioned her about certain plants. Some of these could be quite dangerous if misused, he noted. Celia's response was perfect in its misdirection. Yes, sir. That's why I keep them separate and marked. Wouldn't want anyone making a terrible mistake. The doctor left satisfied, even impressed. He would later tell colleagues about the remarkable enslaved woman who understood pharmacology better than many trained physicians. It never occurred to him that understanding could be weaponized, that knowledge in the wrong hands, or perhaps the right ones, could be revolutionary. This systematic blindness wasn't accidental. It was necessary for the institution of slavery to function. To see enslaved people as fully human, capable of complex planning and deep emotion, would make the system untenable. So they created elaborate fictions: the happy slave, the loyal servant, the simple child needing guidance, and clung to them even as evidence mounted to the contrary. On the eve of Adelaide's wedding, the Beaumont household hummed with anticipation. The family gathered for a final dinner, toasting their good fortune and the alliance about to be cemented. Celia served them personally, moving with the quiet efficiency they had come to expect and depend upon. Master Beaumont even raised his glass to her. To Celia, without whom this celebration would not be possible. She smiled and bowed her head, the perfect picture of humble gratitude. They didn't notice how her hands trembled slightly as she poured the wine. They didn't see the resolution in her eyes. They saw only what they had always seen: a faithful servant, content in her place, grateful for their benevolence. Tomorrow, that blindness would cost them everything. Dawn broke clear and bright on May 15, 1847, as if nature itself celebrated the union of Adelaide Beaumont and Charles Ashford. By 5 o'clock, the kitchen house was already alive with controlled chaos. Celia moved through the preparations like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, every movement precise, every instruction exact. Today, 20 years of faithful service would culminate in a performance none would forget. The kitchen staff, 6 women ranging from young Dora at 14 to old Martha at 60, worked under Celia's direction with practiced efficiency. She had structured the workspace carefully: the main preparation area for the 200 guests, and a smaller, private station where she alone would craft the delicacies for the family table. "The Beaumonts deserve something special," she explained. "I'll handle their portions personal." Her special preparations had begun before dawn. In the privacy of her cabin, she had carefully measured out the oleander extract she'd refined over months. A clear, slightly viscous liquid that mixed perfectly with sugar syrups. The dosage calculations ran through her mind like a prayer. Enough to kill, not so much as to act too quickly. The wedding feast would last hours. She needed the poison to wait until the perfect moment. The wedding cake stood as her masterpiece of deception. 5 tiers of pristine white, decorated with sugar flowers so realistic that butterflies might mistake them for true blooms. But beneath that innocent exterior, the top 2 tiers, reserved exclusively for the Beaumont family table, contained her special ingredient. She had infused the brandy syrup with oleander extract, each layer carefully dosed to ensure even distribution. The buttercream frosting, rich with imported vanilla, masked any hint of bitterness. "Miss Celia, that cake looked like it come from heaven itself," young Dora marveled, pausing in her work to admire it. "Heaven or somewhere else?" Celia murmured, adding another sugar rose. "Now get back to them biscuits. We got 200 mouths to feed." The punch presented a different challenge. The recipe called for champagne, fruit juices, and a touch of brandy, perfect for hiding additional flavors. But liquids were trickier than solids. The poison might separate or create visible residue. Celia solved this by creating a concentrated fruit syrup infused with her extract, which she would add to the family's punch bowl at the last moment. The guests' punch would be identical but for that final, fatal ingredient. Throughout the morning, she maintained rigid separation between the poisoned and pure preparations. The family's portions were marked with subtle signs only she recognized: a different pattern in the icing, a special garnish on the serving platters. She couldn't risk harming the innocent, especially her fellow enslaved people who would be serving and might sneak tastes. By noon, the first guests began arriving. The sound of carriages and cheerful voices drifted to the kitchen, where the pace intensified. Celia supervised the loading of serving carts, ensuring the right dishes went to the right tables. She had trained Dora and Lucy carefully. "You serve the guest tables only. Don't touch nothing from the family table. That's for me and Martha to handle. Them dishes is too delicate for young hands." Overseer McKnight made his usual inspection around 2 o'clock, sampling various dishes with the casual authority of his position. Celia watched carefully as he tasted only from the general preparation area, nodding his approval. "Fine work as always, Celia. Mr. Beaumont will be pleased." "Thank you, sir," she replied, her face a mask of humble pride. "I live to serve." The irony of those words would only become clear later. As the afternoon wore on, Celia made her final preparations. She dissolved a last measure of extract into the special punch, stirring until no trace remained visible. She personally plated the pralines for the family table, each one containing just enough poison to contribute to the cumulative dose. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned for. At 4 o'clock, she received word that the ceremony was concluding. The guests would move to the reception area, where tables groaned under the weight of her creations. The Beaumont family table, elevated on a small platform, displayed the finest of everything, including the top tiers of the wedding cake and the special punch bowl that sparkled in the afternoon sun. Celia supervised the final arrangements, then stepped back to survey her work. To any observer, she appeared to be a devoted servant taking pride in a job well done. Inside, her heart beat a warrior's rhythm. 20 years of swallowed rage, of forced smiles, of watching her children sold away. All of it had led to this moment. "It's time," she said quietly to her kitchen staff. "Remember what I told you about service. Stay with your assigned tables. And whatever happens, keep serving until told otherwise." As the wedding guests began to fill the reception area, as laughter and music filled the air, as the Beaumont family took their places of honor, Celia took her position where she could see everything. The feast of a lifetime was about to begin, and before the sun set, the sweet taste of celebration would turn bitter as wormwood, deadly as the grief that seasoned every dish she'd prepared for those who had stolen everything from her. The golden hour of late afternoon bathed the reception in warm light as Master Jean-Baptiste Beaumont rose to offer the traditional toast. 200 guests fell silent, crystal glasses raised, as he began the speech he'd practiced for weeks. Behind him, the wedding cake towered like a monument to prosperity, while servants circulated with bottles of the special champagne punch reserved for the family table. "My friends," Beaumont began, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn, "today we unite not merely two young people, but two great families, two legacies that will shape Louisiana's future." He raised his glass higher, the amber liquid catching the light. "To Adelaide and Charles, may their union be as sweet as this nectar, as enduring as our sacred traditions, and as fruitful as the land that sustains us all." "Hear, hear," the crowd responded, and drank deeply. At the family table, the Beaumonts, Ashfords, and their closest relations savored their special punch, commenting on its exceptional flavor. Celia, standing at her post near the kitchen entrance, watched with the patience of a hunter who had already released the arrow. The first signs came 40 minutes later, as the cake-cutting ceremony began. Mistress Beaumont pressed a hand to her stomach, her face suddenly pale beneath the rouge. "The heat," she murmured to her sister, "and perhaps too much rich food." But as Adelaide and Charles fed each other the first bites of cake, from the poisoned top tier, Mistress Beaumont's discomfort escalated rapidly. Dr. Thornton, seated at a nearby table, noticed her distress and approached. "Perhaps you should retire inside, madam. Let me examine." His words were cut short as Mistress Beaumont suddenly vomited, the violent retching sending guests scrambling backward. Before the doctor could react, Master Beaumont doubled over, clutching his chest. "My heart," he gasped. "It's racing like... He collapsed to his knees, his glass shattering on the ground. Chaos erupted. Adelaide screamed as her new husband began convulsing. At the family table, Beaumont's brother Charles was seized by similar spasms. The elderly Ashford patriarch clutched his throat, unable to speak, his face turning an alarming shade of blue. Within minutes, 6 members of the two families were in various stages of collapse. Dr. Thornton worked frantically, calling for his medical bag, shouting orders that no one seemed able to follow. "Poison," he declared, the word cutting through the panic like a blade. "They've been poisoned. Don't let anyone else eat or drink anything." The reception descended into pandemonium. Guests fled in terror, some pausing to vomit in the rose bushes, convinced they too were dying. Servants stood frozen, unsure whether to help or run. The overseer McKnight began bellowing orders, demanding all the enslaved people be rounded up and contained. Through it all, Celia remained at her post, her face a perfect mask of shock and concern. When Dr. Thornton demanded to know what the family had eaten, she responded with practiced confusion. "Same as everyone, sir. Everything was prepared together except the family requested their own punch bowl and the top of the cake. Said they wanted the finest portions." "Show me everything," Thornton commanded. "Every ingredient, every pot, every spoon." Celia led him to the kitchen, where the staff huddled in terror. She showed him the preparation areas, the ingredients, even offered tastes from the general food that had been served to all guests. Everything appeared normal. The trial of Celia began 3 days after the wedding, conducted not in a proper courthouse but in the Beaumont Plantation's own dining room, the very space where the family had taken their last meals. The irony was lost on no one. Parish Judge Theodore Whitman, a close friend of the late Master Beaumont, presided over what everyone understood would be less a pursuit of justice than a performance of it. The room had been hastily converted into a makeshift courtroom. Celia stood in chains at the center, surrounded by armed guards who seemed excessive for a single middle-aged woman. The gallery filled with local planters, their faces mixing grief, rage, and fear in equal measure. Outside, the enslaved population of 5 neighboring plantations had been gathered to witness what happened to those who raised their hands against masters. Prosecutor William Thornberry opened with theatrical fury. This woman, trusted with the most intimate position in a Christian household, repaid kindness with murder most foul. 6 souls, including a bride on her wedding day, struck down by poison administered by the very hands that had fed them for 20 years. The physical evidence was damning. Dr. Thornton testified about finding traces of oleander in the victims' stomachs. The special punch bowl, tested, revealed concentrated levels of the poison. The cake's upper tiers, partially consumed, contained enough toxin to kill twice over. Each piece of evidence was displayed to gasps from the gallery. But it was the testimony of the enslaved witnesses that revealed the complex web of complicity and resistance that characterized plantation justice. Old Samuel was called first, his weathered hands trembling as he took his position. "Did you see the accused acting suspiciously?" Thornberry demanded. Samuel's eyes found Celia's for a brief moment before dropping. "Miss Celia, she worked her garden like always, grew healing plants for the family, she did. Never seen her do nothing wrong. But you must have noticed something," the prosecutor pressed. "The poisonous plants, the late-night preparations." The editorial was immediately suppressed, its author run out of town. But the questions it raised lingered like the bitter aftertaste of oleander, impossible to wash away. Celia was dead, but her legacy lived on in every nervous glance at a dinner plate, every suspicious sniff of wine, every planter who wondered if today their sins would finally find them out. She had poisoned more than a wedding feast. She had poisoned the very illusion of safety that made slavery bearable for those who benefited from it. The Beaumont tragedy, while fictional, illuminates a historical truth that no amount of romanticization can obscure. Slavery was a system of violence that inevitably bred violence in return. The poisoned wedding feast serves as a metaphor for the entire institution, a surface of civility and order concealing depths of brutality that poisoned everyone it touched. Fictional historian Dr. Margaret Thornfield, writing in her analysis Bondage and Bloodshed, Resistance in the Antebellum South, observed, "The Beaumont case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about violence and morality. When a system denies people legal recourse, peaceful protest, even the right to their own children, can we be surprised when they turn to the only weapons available?" Celia's actions were extreme, but they were born from extremity. The Beaumonts, like many enslavers, had constructed elaborate justifications for their actions. Master Beaumont's journals reveal a man who genuinely believed he was a good master. He provided adequate food, rarely used the whip himself, and allowed his enslaved people to maintain garden plots. In his mind, selling mercy was a regrettable economic necessity, not an act of soul-crushing cruelty. This self-delusion was essential to the system's function. But the enslaved experienced a different reality. Every kindness existed within a framework of absolute powerlessness. A well-fed slave was still a slave. A slave allowed to marry could still see their spouse sold. A slave permitted to have children would inevitably watch those children become property. The violence wasn't only in the whip or the chain, it was in the very condition of being owned. Dr. Thornfield's analysis continues. Celia's poisoning of the Beaumont family was not an aberration but part of a continuum of resistance that ranged from work slowdowns to armed rebellion. What made her act particularly terrifying to the planter class was its intimacy. She used the trust they had forced upon her, the closeness required by household slavery, as a weapon against them. The historical record, though often suppressed or distorted, contains numerous instances of enslaved people using poison against their oppressors. Court records from across the South document cases of cooks and healers accused of poisoning. Most were executed whether guilty or not, their stories buried along with their bodies. But each case sent the same message. The enslaved were not passive victims but active agents who would seize whatever means of resistance they could find. The cycle of violence that slavery created was self-perpetuating. Masters used violence to maintain control. The enslaved, when pushed beyond endurance, responded with violence. This led to harsher restrictions, which bred deeper resentments, which eventually exploded into more violence. The Beaumont poisonings, in this context, were not a beginning or an end but a particularly dramatic point in an ongoing war. What makes Celia's fictional story particularly poignant is the price she knew she would pay. She didn't poison the Beaumonts expecting to escape or to spark a general uprising. She did it knowing she would die, choosing to make her death meaningful rather than live with meaningless suffering. This calculus, that death with agency was preferable to life without it, was one that thousands of enslaved people made in various ways. The aftermath of the poisonings revealed another truth about slavery's violence. It corrupted justice itself. Celia's trial was a foregone conclusion not because of the evidence, she freely confessed, but because the system could not allow enslaved people to kill masters and live. The law existed not to provide justice but to maintain order, and that order depended on absolute racial hierarchy. Even the religious institutions that might have provided moral guidance were compromised. Churches that preached "thou shalt not kill" to the enslaved remained silent about the daily murders of the slave system, the social death of bondage, the literal deaths from overwork and abuse, the spiritual death of having one's humanity denied. They condemned Celia's violence while sanctifying the violence done to her. Dr. Thornfield concludes, "The tragedy of the Beaumont poisonings is not just in the deaths that occurred, but in the system that made such deaths inevitable. Slavery poisoned the moral well from which everyone drank. It created a society where Celia's only path to justice was through murder, where the Beaumonts' only response to economic pressure was to sell a child, where every human relationship was warped by the fundamental inhumanity of human bondage." Celia's last words, "They sold my baby," echo through history as both explanation and indictment. They remind us that behind every act of resistance, no matter how extreme, was a human being pushed beyond the bounds of endurance. They force us to see that the true poison in the antebellum South was not oleander in the wedding cake but slavery in the social fabric. A toxin that killed slowly but surely, corrupting everything it touched until violence became not just possible but inevitable.